Rome wasn't built in a day, but it changed the world forever. Before there was an empire, before the legions marched and emperors ruled, there was just a small city on the banks of the Tiber River. Humble, vulnerable, unknown. That city would become Rome, a name that still echoes through courtrooms, cathedrals, and capitol buildings across the world. But this isn't just the story of one empire. It's the story of how power is built, how it crumbles, and how its memory refuses to disappear. Because Rome didn't just conquer land, it conquered ideas. Its influence lives on in our languages, our laws, our buildings, and even in the way we think about leadership, citizenship, and war. Over the course of 1,000 years, Rome rose from a tribal kingdom to a global superpower. It fended off invading armies, tore itself apart in civil wars, and still found ways to rebuild, stronger, sharper, and more ambitious than before. It gave the world names like Caesar, Augustus, and Constantine, names that still carry weight. It would fall, divide, reform, and fall again. And yet somehow, it never truly died. This is a story of ambition and betrayal, glory and ruin, brilliance and collapse. It's written in stone, in blood, and in memory. From the myth of Romulus and Remus to the final fall of Constantinople, this is the entire history of the Roman Empire, told as one sweeping saga. Before emperors ruled and legions marched, Rome began with a myth soaked in blood and destiny. According to legend, it all started with two brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned as infants and left to die by a jealous king. But fate had other plans. A she-wolf, fierce and maternal, discovered the twins and nursed them to life in the wild. Later, a shepherd took them in and raised them as his own. As they grew, so did their ambition. They discovered their royal bloodline and overthrew the king who had tried to destroy them. But the real story was just beginning. The twins set out to build a new city on the banks of the Tiber River, but disagreement quickly turned into tragedy. When they couldn't agree on where to build, or who should lead, Romulus killed his brother. From fratricide, Rome was born. Romulus became the city's first king, giving it his name and setting the foundation for what would become an empire. Whether the story is fact or fable, doesn't matter. The Romans believed it. And in that belief, they found a symbol, that Rome was destined to rise, not in peace, but through conflict, sacrifice, and unshakable will. In the myth of Romulus and Remus, we see the blueprint of Roman identity. Strength over sentiment, order over chaos, and a city built not just to exist, but to endure. This was just the beginning. After the legendary Romulus founded Rome in 753 BCE, the city entered its first true age, the Roman kingdom. For over 200 years, Rome was ruled not by emperors or elected senators, but by kings, some real, others wrapped in myth. Romulus, the first king, organized the city's first army, laid out its political and religious foundations, and filled its empty streets by offering asylum to outcasts and exiles. According to tradition, he ruled until disappearing in a mysterious storm, later worshipped as a god. He was followed by a line of 6 more kings, each adding new layers to Rome's foundation. Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king, was a peaceful Sabine who shaped the city's religious institutions, creating temples, priesthoods, and sacred rites. He taught Romans that law and ritual were just as powerful as the sword. Later kings introduced urban planning, public works, and expanded territory. Tullus Hostilius and Ancus Marcius built bridges, aqueducts, and walls. The final king, however, would seal the fate of monarchy in Rome. His name was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin ruled with arrogance and cruelty, ignoring the Senate and suppressing dissent. But it was a personal tragedy, the assault of a noblewoman, Lucretia, by the king's son, that sparked revolution. Outraged, Rome's aristocrats rose up and overthrew the monarchy. In 509 BCE, the Roman kingdom fell. In its place, the Romans vowed never again to be ruled by a king. They founded a new system, one that would become the Roman Republic. The era of kings was over, but the empire was only just beginning. Rome wasn't born in isolation. It was shaped by a collision of ancient cultures that left their mark on everything from architecture to religion. The early Romans were Latins, but they didn't live alone. To the north were the Etruscans, a mysterious and advanced people. To the south, along the Italian coast, lay Greek colonies, bustling with art, trade, and philosophy. The Latins gave Rome its language, Latin, and a deep sense of identity rooted in land and tradition. Their values, family loyalty, discipline, and duty, would become the moral backbone of Roman society. The Etruscans, though eventually conquered, played a vital role in Rome's early development. They taught the Romans how to build cities, with arches, roads, and drainage systems. They introduced symbols of power like the fasces, a bundle of rods and an axe, used later by Roman magistrates. Even the Roman gladiatorial games likely came from Etruscan funeral rituals. The Greeks brought ideas. Their influence flowed into Rome through trade and colonization. The Romans adopted Greek gods, renaming Zeus as Jupiter, Athena as Minerva. Greek art, drama, and philosophy laid the intellectual foundations of Roman education. Rome didn't just absorb these influences, it refined and repurposed them. It was a city that learned, adapted, and evolved. From the Latins, it gained its soul. From the Etruscans, its structure. From the Greeks, its mind. This cultural fusion didn't weaken Rome. It made it stronger. A civilization built not on purity, but on adaptation. That's how empires are born. Rome's last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled with arrogance and fear. He ignored the Senate, crushed opposition, and treated Rome like his personal kingdom. But it wasn't politics that ended his reign. It was a crime that ignited a revolution. According to Roman tradition, Tarquin's son, Sextus, assaulted a noblewoman named Lucretia. Dishonored and devastated, Lucretia took her own life. Her death sent shockwaves through Roman society. The people, outraged, turned against the monarchy. Led by Lucius Junius Brutus, Rome's aristocrats rallied the people and drove the king into exile. It was more than just rebellion. It was a rejection of tyranny. In 509 BCE, Rome abolished its monarchy. No more kings. In their place, the Romans created a new system of government, the Republic. Power would no longer rest in the hands of one man, but would be shared, checked, and limited. At the heart of this system were two consuls, elected annually to lead together, so no single ruler could seize power. A senate of aristocrats advised them, while assemblies of citizens passed laws and elected officials. It wasn't a democracy by modern standards. Only free, land-owning men could vote, but it was revolutionary for its time. Rome had created a government that blended monarchy, aristocracy, and popular rule, and it would endure for nearly 500 years. The fall of the kings wasn't the end of Rome's story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, where power was a privilege, not a birthright. When Rome cast out its kings, it didn't just tear down a monarchy. It reimagined power itself. In place of a single ruler, the Romans built a complex political system designed to prevent tyranny and balance authority. At the center of it all were three pillars: the Senate, the consuls, and a series of carefully crafted checks on power. The Senate, made up of Rome's elite aristocrats, held immense influence. Though technically an advisory body, its members, mostly former magistrates, controlled finances, foreign policy, and state religion. It didn't make laws, but its authority was rooted in tradition. And in Rome, tradition held more weight than any crown. To lead the state, Romans elected 2 consuls each year. These men shared power equally and could veto each other's decisions. One led the armies, the other managed civil affairs, but both were temporary. After their 1-year term, they returned to ordinary life. No permanence, no crown, no kings. And yet even in crisis, Rome had a safeguard. In times of extreme danger, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single ruler with absolute power, but only for 6 months. It was a tool of survival, not domination. Beneath the Senate and consuls were other magistrates and popular assemblies, giving ordinary citizens a voice, albeit a limited one. Rome's republic was far from perfect, but its brilliance lay in one idea: power must be divided, limited, and answerable to the people. A radical idea at the time. A legacy that still shapes governments today. While Rome's republic promised freedom from kings, it didn't promise equality. From its very beginning, Roman society was divided, not by wealth, but by birth. At the top were the patricians, aristocratic families who claimed noble ancestry and held nearly all political power. Below them were the plebeians, the common people, farmers, soldiers, craftsmen, and laborers. The republic may have belonged to the people in name, but in practice, it belonged to the patricians. Only they could become senators, consuls, or priests. They controlled the land, the laws, and the courts. Meanwhile, the plebeians carried the burdens, fighting Rome's wars, paying Rome's taxes, and building its roads. Tensions boiled for decades. The plebeians didn't revolt with weapons, but with absence. They staged what the Romans called secessions of the plebs, walking out of the city en masse, refusing to work or serve in the army. Rome would grind to a halt, forcing the elites to negotiate. Slowly, painfully, the plebeians won concessions. They gained their own political representatives called tribunes of the plebs, who could veto unfair laws. They demanded written laws, resulting in the 12 Tables, Rome's first public legal code. Over time, plebeians could hold office, marry into patrician families, and even become consuls. The line between classes blurred, but it never truly disappeared. The struggle between the powerful and the powerless wasn't just a Roman problem. It was a human one. And in Rome, this class conflict didn't destroy the Republic. For a while at least, it helped define it. Rome wasn't always a mighty empire. In its early days, it was just one city among many, surrounded by hostile neighbors and competing tribes. But through centuries of war, alliances, and relentless ambition, Rome slowly expanded its grip, not across continents, but across the Italian peninsula. Early enemies included the Etruscans to the north, who had once ruled over Rome, and the powerful Samnites to the south, fierce mountain warriors who resisted Roman control. Then there were the Latins, Rome's closest cultural cousins, and the Volsci and Aequi, who harassed Roman borders for generations. Expansion wasn't quick, it was brutal and costly. The Latin War, 340 to 338 BCE, helped Rome dominate nearby city-states. The Samnite Wars dragged on for decades, testing Rome's endurance and forcing it to adapt its military strategies. Each conflict taught Rome valuable lessons: how to build roads, manage alliances, and reshape defeated enemies into allies. But what set Rome apart wasn't just its military power, it was its political genius. Rather than simply destroy its enemies, Rome often offered them citizenship, protection, and a place in the Roman system. It didn't just conquer, it incorporated. By 264 BCE, Rome had subdued most of the Italian peninsula. What began as a small city was now the dominant power in Italy. But this was only the beginning. Across the sea stood a rival, Carthage, wealthy, powerful, and watching. And Rome was about to learn that building an empire in Italy was easy compared to defending one on a global stage. In the 3rd century BCE, Rome faced its greatest threat, not from the north, but from across the sea. In Carthage, a rival power in North Africa, a military genius was rising. His name was Hannibal Barca, and he would become the Romans' worst nightmare. The conflict, known as the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, began with a bold promise. Hannibal swore an oath to his father to never be a friend of Rome, and he kept it. Instead of attacking Italy by sea, he did the unthinkable. He marched his army across Spain, through Gaul, and over the towering Alps. It was a journey of mythic proportions. Tens of thousands of men, cavalry, and 37 war elephants, crossing snow-covered mountains, braving avalanches, ambushes, and starvation. Many died along the way. But against all odds, Hannibal emerged from the Alps and into Italy. The Romans were stunned. No one expected an enemy to appear from the north, least of all, riding elephants. Hannibal wasted no time. He won devastating victories at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, where he encircled and destroyed an entire Roman army. Nearly 50,000 Romans dead in a single day. It was one of the worst defeats in Rome's history. And yet, Hannibal never took Rome itself. He lacked the siege equipment, the reinforcements, and perhaps the political will. Still, for nearly 2 decades, Hannibal haunted Italy, a living reminder that even Rome could bleed, and Rome would never forget it. By the time the Third Punic War erupted in 149 BCE, Rome was no longer fighting a rival. It was erasing a memory. Carthage, once a great maritime power, had already been defeated in 2 brutal wars, but its very existence still haunted Rome's pride. Despite being weakened, Carthage had begun to recover, rebuilding trade, restoring defenses, and refusing to ask Rome's permission. That was enough. To many Roman senators, especially Cato the Elder, Carthage had no right to survive. His chilling refrain echoed through the Senate. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Rome answered with fire and steel. The Roman legions besieged the city for 3 long years. Carthage resisted with everything it had. Men, women, even children fought from house to house. But in 146 BCE, the walls finally fell. What followed was not just conquest, it was annihilation. The city was burned to the ground. Over 150,000 people were killed or sold into slavery. Carthage's harbor was filled in. Its culture, records, and power were reduced to ash. Legend says the Romans salted the earth so nothing would grow there again. Perhaps not literally, but the message was clear. Carthage would never rise again. With Carthage gone, Rome stood unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean. But something had changed. Rome was no longer just a republic fighting for survival. It had become an empire in all but name, hungry, ruthless, and unopposed. The destruction of Carthage was the birth cry of Roman dominance, and the beginning of a new, more dangerous Rome. When Rome first set out to control the Italian peninsula, it was just one player among many. But by the end of the 3rd century BCE, something had changed. Rome was no longer a regional force. It was on its way to becoming the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. The Punic Wars had been the turning point. With Carthage destroyed, Rome now controlled North Africa, Spain, and key islands like Sicily and Sardinia. It had gained not only land, but immense wealth, Gold, silver, slaves, and strategic ports that gave it dominance over trade routes stretching from Greece to Egypt. But Rome wasn't finished. In the east, it turned its attention to the fractured remnants of Alexander the Great's empire. One by one, Rome defeated the Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, Greece, and eventually the Seleucid Empire. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Roman legions were marching through Athens, Corinth, and even into Asia Minor. Every victory brought more riches and more responsibility. Rome now had to govern not just Italians, but Greeks, Egyptians, and Iberians. Provinces were created, taxes collected, and roads built to connect an empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Persia. But with expansion came consequences. The wealth flowing into Rome deepened class divisions. Ambitious generals grew powerful, and the Senate struggled to control it all. Still, for now, Rome stood unmatched. A republic on the surface, but an empire in practice, holding the Mediterranean in its iron grip. The Romans had a name for it: Mare Nostrum, our sea. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had conquered the Mediterranean. But at home, the Republic was fracturing from within. The wars had brought wealth beyond imagination, but it didn't reach everyone. A handful of elite families, the senatorial class, controlled the spoils. Vast estates, political offices, and lucrative provinces. Meanwhile, the average Roman farmer, who had once been the backbone of the Republic, was being crushed. Many had left their fields to fight in Rome's wars, only to return and find their land bought out or ruined. They flooded into the city, jobless and desperate. The Roman countryside turned into massive latifundia, plantations worked by slaves, not citizens. The city of Rome swelled with poor, unemployed citizens, reliant on state grain and easily swayed by promises of reform or revenge. In the Senate, corruption ran deep. Officials lined their pockets while claiming to serve the people. Bribery was common. Public office had become a path to personal fortune. Voices began to rise. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, tribunes who tried to return land to the poor and curb senatorial power. Both were murdered, their reforms crushed in blood. Rome had learned a new, dangerous lesson. Political change could be answered with violence. Riots, assassinations, and mob rule became more common. Loyalty to the Republic faded. In its place rose a new loyalty, not to Rome, but to individual generals and populist leaders. The Roman Republic was still standing, but the ground beneath it had begun to shake. The seeds of civil war had been sown. In the late 2nd century BCE, two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, stood before the Roman Republic and asked a dangerous question. What happens when the system no longer serves the people? They were born into privilege, sons of a powerful patrician family. But instead of defending the elite, the Gracchi became champions of the poor. They had seen the widening gap between the rich and the common citizen. Rome's victories had brought land, wealth, and slaves, but only to a few. The average Roman farmer was being pushed off his land, replaced by slave-run estates. Cities were swelling with the jobless and hopeless. In 133 BCE, Tiberius, as tribune, proposed a radical solution: redistribute public land to the poor. It wasn't a new idea, but now it threatened powerful interests. The Senate was outraged. Tiberius bypassed them entirely, appealing directly to the People's Assembly. That act alone broke sacred political norms. When he ran for re-election, a move seen as dangerously ambitious, he was clubbed to death by senators and their followers on the Capitoline Hill. A decade later, his brother Gaius picked up the torch. He pushed for broader reforms: grain subsidies, citizenship for allies, and limits on senatorial power. He too was met with fierce resistance. In 121 BCE, after a violent standoff, Gaius was killed in a purge ordered by the Senate. The deaths of the Gracchi brothers marked a turning point. Rome's republic had silenced reform not with debate, but with blood. And the cracks in the system had become impossible to ignore. As the republic unraveled, ambition replaced loyalty, and the sword began to speak louder than the Senate. It began with Gaius Marius, a general of humble birth who rose to power by promising land to his soldiers. He reformed the Roman army, allowing landless citizens to join the legions. In doing so, he created something dangerous: soldiers loyal not to the republic, but to their general. Then came Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician general who clashed with Marius over control of the army. When the Senate gave Sulla command of a war in Asia, Marius used political maneuvering to steal it. Sulla responded with an unthinkable act. He marched on Rome with his army, something no Roman general had ever done. What followed was Rome's first civil war, a brutal power struggle. Sulla seized power, declared himself dictator, and unleashed proscriptions, public kill lists targeting his enemies. Thousands died. The Republic had been hijacked, not by kings, but by its own commanders. Decades later, history repeated itself, only bigger. Julius Caesar, a brilliant general, won fame and loyalty in Gaul. The Senate, fearful of his rising power, ordered him to disband his army. Instead, in 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, declaring civil war against his former ally, Pompey the Great. Caesar's forces swept through Italy, Spain, and Greece. Pompey fled and was eventually killed in Egypt. With his rivals gone, Caesar took control of Rome, not as king, but as dictator for life. Once again, the Republic was gasping for air, and this time, it wouldn't recover. Julius Caesar didn't just climb the Roman ladder, he rewrote the rules on the way up. Born into a patrician family in 100 BCE, Caesar wasn't content with wealth or noble blood. He craved greatness. He started as a young politician, charming, ambitious, and deeply in debt. But what he lacked in coin, he made up for with rhetoric, charisma, and ruthless calculation. His big break came through a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate, a power-sharing deal with Pompey the Great, Rome's top general, and Crassus, its richest man. With their backing, Caesar became consul in 59 BCE. But he had bigger plans. He took command in Gaul, where over the next 8 years, he launched one of the most spectacular military campaigns in Roman history. Caesar conquered vast territories, crushed rebel tribes, and even crossed into Britain, something no Roman had done before. His commentaries on the Gallic War, written in clear, persuasive Latin, made him a legend back in Rome. His army adored him. He paid them well, shared in their hardships, and led from the front. His victories filled Rome's coffers and his own pockets. To the people, Caesar was a hero. To the Senate, he was a growing threat. When the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome alone, Caesar made a fateful choice. He crossed the Rubicon, declaring civil war. By then, Caesar wasn't just a general. He was a symbol of power, of reform, and to some of tyranny still to come. In 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the edge of a shallow Italian river called the Rubicon, a modest stream with massive consequences. By Roman law, no general was allowed to lead an army into Italy proper. To do so was considered an act of war against the Republic. The Senate, growing fearful of Caesar's ambition, had ordered him to step down and return to Rome as a private citizen. They expected obedience, but Caesar had no intention of surrendering his power or his life. With a single step across the Rubicon, Caesar made his choice. According to legend, he spoke the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, He had just committed treason, but also something far more potent: revolution. Rome would never be the same. As Caesar's legions marched south, panic spread through the capital. His rival, Pompey the Great, fled with the Senate. The Republic, already fractured by years of corruption and violence, was now at war with itself. The Rubicon wasn't just a river. It was a line between old Rome and new Rome, between republican tradition and autocratic power. By crossing it, Caesar didn't just challenge his enemies. He challenged the very system that had made him. And the people? Many welcomed him. They saw in Caesar not a traitor, but a savior, someone who might finally bring order to chaos. The Rubicon marked the end of compromise. The Republic had been crossed, and there was no going back. After years of civil war, Julius Caesar emerged victorious. He defeated Pompey's forces, swept through the Roman world, and returned to Rome not as a general, but as a dictator. First for a year, then for 10, and finally, for life. To his supporters, Caesar was a reformer. He expanded citizenship, reduced debt, restructured the calendar, and took on the corrupt aristocracy. He filled the Senate with loyalists and bypassed traditional power structures. Rome was functioning again, but not as a republic. It now revolved around one man. To the elite, that was the problem. Caesar's growing power alarmed the old guard. Statues, temples, even a golden throne in the Senate, all suggested not just leadership, but kingship. And for Romans, the idea of a king was unforgivable. The memory of Tarquin the Proud still haunted them. On March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey for a Senate meeting. He never walked out. A group of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, stabbed him 23 times. They claimed they were saving the Republic. But the Republic they hoped to save was already gone. Caesar's death plunged Rome into another civil war. The conspirators had killed the man, but not the movement. In trying to stop a tyrant, they had created a martyr. And Rome? It didn't return to the old ways. Instead, it would soon bow to a new kind of ruler, one with absolute power, cloaked in the name of emperor. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Rome was thrown into chaos once again. His murderers claimed they had saved the Republic, but they had only opened the floodgates. Into that power vacuum stepped three men, bound by ambition and vengeance: Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legally recognized three-man dictatorship with sweeping authority to punish Caesar's enemies and restore order by any means necessary. Octavian was Caesar's teenage heir, young, quiet, underestimated. But behind his soft demeanor was a cold, calculating mind. Antony, Caesar's loyal general, was a battle-hardened orator and war hero. Lepidus, the least influential of the three, was given control of North Africa. A consolation prize, really. Their first act was brutal. They issued proscriptions, public hit lists of political enemies. Thousands were executed, including the great orator Cicero. This wasn't justice. It was retribution. The triumvirs crushed the forces of Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's assassins, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. But once the common enemy was gone, the alliance began to rot. Lepidus was quickly pushed aside. Antony ruled the East and fell under the sway of Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. Their relationship scandalized Rome and gave Octavian the perfect excuse to act. The Second Triumvirate had been formed to restore the Republic. But in the end, it only cleared the way for one man to rule alone. And Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was just getting started. The Republic was on its last breath. An empire was rising. They were the most powerful couple in the ancient world. Mark Antony, the Roman war hero, and Cleopatra VII, the brilliant queen of Egypt. Together they ruled the eastern Mediterranean. But to many in Rome, they were not rulers. They were a threat. After the death of Julius Caesar, Antony took command of the East. There, he met Cleopatra, not for the first time, and fell deeply under her spell. Their union was more than romance. It was political. Cleopatra was wealthy, strategic, and determined to keep Egypt independent. Antony, in turn, saw in her a partner to challenge Rome's rising power in the West. That power was Octavian, Caesar's heir, and now Antony's greatest rival. In Rome, Octavian launched a propaganda war, portraying Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, corrupted by luxury, and betraying Roman values. When Antony gave parts of Roman land to Cleopatra's children, Octavian used it to stir outrage. By 31 BCE, the conflict exploded into war. At the Battle of Actium, Octavian's fleet crushed Antony and Cleopatra's forces. Their dream of ruling the world together sank with their ships. Fleeing to Egypt, they chose death over defeat. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, days later, took her own life, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. With their deaths, the last resistance to Octavian vanished. Egypt became a Roman province. The Roman Republic, already on life support, was gone. All that remained was for Octavian to crown himself something new. Augustus, Rome's first emperor. In the aftermath of civil war and the fall of Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian stood alone. He had outmaneuvered every rival, inherited Caesar's legacy, and held control over the Roman military, treasury, and government. But Octavian knew Rome still hated the idea of kingship. So, instead of seizing power with a crown, he did something smarter. He asked to give it all back. In 27 BCE, standing before the Senate, Octavian claimed he was restoring the Republic. In return, they gave him something more powerful than any title of old. The name Augustus, meaning the revered one. It wasn't a crown, it was a symbol, and the people accepted it. Augustus was no ordinary ruler. He kept the outward shell of the Republic, Senate, consuls, elections, but he controlled them all from behind the curtain. He held lifelong power over the army, the provinces, and the laws. Rome was still a republic in name, but in reality, it had become an empire, and Augustus was its first emperor. Under his rule, the empire stabilized. Roads were built, trade flourished, and the legions secured Rome's borders. He ushered in an era of peace known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, that would last for 2 centuries. Augustus didn't just change Rome. He became Rome, its face, its voice, its destiny. The Republic had died, but the empire was just beginning, and its first emperor had learned the greatest Roman lesson. Power lasts longer when it pretends to be something else. With Augustus at the helm, the Roman world entered a rare and golden moment in its long, turbulent history: peace. For the first time in centuries, the swords were sheathed, and Rome looked inward, not to conquer, but to build. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, was more than just an absence of war. It was a sweeping transformation of the known world. Rome's legions, once engines of conquest, now became architects of empire. They constructed a vast network of roads, over 50,000 miles, linking cities, forts, and ports from Britannia to Judea. These roads didn't just move armies, they moved people, ideas, and goods. Trade flourished. Grain from Egypt, silk from China, spices from India, wine from Gaul. The Roman Empire became a marketplace of civilizations. Protected by Roman law and Roman roads, merchants traveled with confidence. Ports buzzed, markets thrived. The Mediterranean, once full of pirates, was now Rome's highway. Mare Nostrum, our sea. Rome also brought with it a legal system, one that emphasized order, contracts, and citizenship. Roman law influenced not just the elites, but ordinary people. If you were a Roman citizen, you had rights. Rights that would echo through legal systems for millennia to come. At home, cities boomed. Public baths, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and temples redefined urban life. For many, life under Rome brought stability, structure, and opportunity. It wasn't a perfect peace. But for a time, the empire held together, not just by force, but by roads, laws, and the promise of prosperity. This was the Roman dream at its height. Rome didn't just conquer the world, it reshaped it. As Roman legions marched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they carried more than swords. They brought with them a way of life, a culture rooted in law, architecture, language, and identity. To be Roman was to be part of something bigger than tribe or tradition. It was civilization. At the heart of Rome's cultural power was engineering. The Romans were masters of concrete, arches, and aqueducts. They built roads that cut through mountains, bridges that defied rivers, and domes that reached toward the heavens. Their aqueducts carried fresh water for miles, feeding the baths, fountains, and homes of massive cities. Their amphitheaters echoed with the roar of crowds, entertainment as a tool of unity and control. Cities became Roman hubs. In Gaul, Egypt, Judea, Rome built in stone what it wanted to last. Forums, temples, baths, and markets sprang up across the empire. Latin became the language of law and power. Roman dress, customs, and calendars crept into daily life. But Rome didn't erase local cultures. It absorbed them. Greek gods were renamed and folded into Roman religion. Egyptian art influenced Roman design. Eastern cults found followers in Roman streets. Rome didn't just expand by conquest. It expanded by assimilation. By the 2nd century CE, a man born in Spain or Syria could serve in the Roman Senate or command a legion. Citizenship spread. Roads and law stitched distant provinces into one imperial fabric. Rome's greatest achievement wasn't just its military, it was its ability to make the world Roman. In 180 CE, Rome lost more than an emperor. It lost its balance. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, had held the empire together through war, plague, and unrest. He ruled not with cruelty or vanity, but with thought, discipline, and a deep sense of duty. His death marked the end of the Pax Romana, that fragile 2-century stretch of Roman peace. Unlike his predecessors, Marcus made a fateful choice. He handed power to his son, Commodus. Where Marcus was thoughtful, Commodus was reckless. He fancied himself a gladiator, fighting in the arena while the empire's borders cracked. Under his rule, corruption spread. The Senate was silenced, and the army became more loyal to gold than to Rome. His reign ended in assassination, strangled in his bath by a wrestler, part of yet another palace plot. But the damage was done. The era of stable succession and principled rule had died with Marcus. What followed was chaos, civil wars, barracks emperors rising and falling at the whim of the army. Provinces rebelled. Enemies pressed in from all sides, Goths, Parthians, Vandals. And through it all, Rome's foundations, once built on discipline and order, began to crack. The death of Marcus Aurelius didn't bring immediate collapse, but it ended an age when Rome believed in itself. The golden years were over. The empire was still vast, still powerful. But from now on, it would be fighting to hold on, not to rise higher. After the golden glow of the Pax Romana faded, Rome entered an age of crisis. It wasn't one disaster. It was a storm of them, crashing down again and again until even the strongest parts of the empire began to buckle. First came the plagues. As early as the 1600s CE, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the empire, brought back by soldiers returning from the east. It killed as many as 5 million people, including possibly Emperor Lucius Verus. Cities emptied, armies weakened. Fields went unplanted, and Rome's vast network of trade turned into a web of contagion. Then came the invasions. Along the empire's northern borders, Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Goths, Vandals, began pressing into Roman territory. The legions, once unbeatable, were stretched thin. The empire responded by raising more armies, often filled with mercenaries who had little loyalty to Rome itself. And behind it all, the economy was unraveling. The endless wars and massive bureaucracy drained the treasury. To cover expenses, emperors debased the currency, reducing the silver content of Roman coins. Inflation surged, confidence collapsed, people reverted to barter, and local economies fractured. As roads became dangerous and towns isolated, trade declined. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands, and the once vibrant cities began to shrink. Rome was still Rome, massive, awe-inspiring, and powerful on paper. But underneath the marble, the cracks were spreading. Disease, invasion, and financial ruin weren't just problems. They were symptoms of something deeper. An empire no longer expanding, but slowly, painfully, beginning to fall inward. Between 235 and 284 CE, the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under its own weight. In just 50 years, 26 emperors came and went, most of them murdered, overthrown, or killed in battle. It was a time of anarchy, bloodshed, and desperation. The Roman world had plunged into what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century. It began with the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus, killed by his own troops for trying to negotiate with Germanic tribes rather than crush them. That act set a deadly precedent. Power now belonged to whoever the army liked best. Emperors rose through military strength, not political order, but the same soldiers who lifted them up could tear them down just as fast. The empire fractured. Gaul and Britain broke away in the west. In the east, Palmyra, led by Queen Zenobia, formed a separate empire, ruling much of the eastern provinces. Rome itself was no longer the heart of the empire. It was just another city in crisis. At the same time, external threats intensified. Goths crossed the Danube, Persians attacked from the east, and plagues returned, ravaging an already weakened population. The economy was in free fall. Trade routes were unsafe, and civil war was constant. Rome had survived wars, plagues, and mad emperors before, but never all at once. And yet, incredibly, it endured. Out of the chaos would rise a new leader, Diocletian, who would try to restore order by reshaping the empire itself. But after this storm, Rome would never be the same again. By the late 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire was bleeding from every wound: military, economic, and political. But in the darkest hour, a soldier emperor emerged from the ranks. His name was Diocletian, and he didn't try to return Rome to its past glory. Instead, he rebuilt it, brick by brick, rule by rule. Diocletian understood one thing clearly: the empire was too big for one man to manage. So he made a radical move. He split it. In 293 CE, he established the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four, dividing the empire into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor, Augustus, and deputy, Caesar. 4 rulers, 4 capitals, 1 empire, at least in theory. He also overhauled the economy. Prices had spiraled out of control, so Diocletian issued price edicts, froze wages, and tried to restore faith in Roman currency. To keep the army strong, he made military service compulsory for many families. His reforms were harsh, but for a while they worked. After Diocletian retired, one of the few emperors to do so peacefully, His successor, Constantine, carried the torch. He reunified the empire under his rule and made another monumental change. He embraced Christianity. In 313 CE, the Edict of Milan legalized the once persecuted faith, and in 330 CE, he founded a new capital, Constantinople, in the east. Rome had changed. It was now more bureaucratic, more militarized, and more spiritual. The empire had been patched together, but the cracks had never fully healed. The West would fall. But the East, it would survive for 1,000 more years. By the late 4th century CE, it was clear. Rome could no longer function as one united empire. The challenges were too great, the borders too vast, the enemies too many. And so, what had once been one Roman world was formally split into two halves, East and West. The idea wasn't new. Diocletian's tetrarchy had already shown that dividing rule could restore control. But by 395 CE, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the division became permanent. His two sons inherited the empire. Honorius ruled the west from Ravenna, while Arcadius ruled the east from Constantinople. This wasn't just administrative, it was cultural. The Western Roman Empire, centered around Rome and Latin tradition, was under constant pressure from Germanic invasions, economic collapse, and internal decay. Cities shrank. Armies struggled. The West was a crumbling frontier. The Eastern Roman Empire, later known as Byzantium, had advantages the West lacked. It was wealthier, more urbanized, and better fortified. Constantinople, with its massive walls and strategic location, became the new beating heart of the empire. Though they shared Roman law, titles, and identity, East and West were growing apart, in language, religion, and fate. Rome was no longer one empire, but two, and only one of them would stand the test of time. The other was running out of road. In the early 4th century CE, the Roman world was changing, and no one changed it more than Constantine the Great. For centuries, Christianity had been a small, persecuted sect, blamed for disasters and hunted by emperors. But Constantine's rise would reverse the empire's religious course forever. According to legend, before a decisive battle at the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine saw a sign in the sky. A cross of light with the words, "In this sign, conquer." He ordered his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields, and won. A year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity across the empire. For the first time, Christians could worship openly, own property, and build churches. Constantine didn't outlaw the old gods, but he gave Christianity imperial favor, funding basilicas and granting bishops power. But Constantine's vision wasn't just spiritual, it was political. He believed the empire needed a new capital, far from the decaying West. In 330 CE, he founded Constantinople on the ancient site of Byzantium, a city on the edge of Europe and Asia, surrounded by water and walls. Constantinople was a new Rome, Christian, Eastern, and designed to last. It would become the center of imperial power for over 1,000 years. With Constantine, the old gods faded, and a new empire, Roman in name, Christian in spirit, took shape. He didn't just build a city, he reshaped the soul of Rome. By the 5th century CE, the Western Roman Empire was crumbling at the edges. Its borders, once held by legions, now buckled under pressure from wave after wave of so-called barbarian tribes. But these were not aimless raiders. They were entire peoples, pushed westward by fear, hunger, and the shadow of something even worse. It began with the Visigoths, a Germanic tribe who had once been allies of Rome. Fleeing the terrifying advance of the Huns from Central Asia, they sought refuge within Roman territory. But instead of safety, they found abuse and exploitation at Roman hands. In 378 CE, they rebelled, and at the Battle of Adrianople, they did the unthinkable. They killed a Roman emperor and shattered the myth of invincibility. Then, in 410 CE, the unthinkable happened again. Led by Alaric, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome, the first time in 800 years that the Eternal City had fallen. Shock rippled across the empire. Next came the Vandals, sweeping through Gaul, Spain, and finally into North Africa, Rome's breadbasket. In 455 CE, they too reached Rome, looting it with cold precision. Their name would live on as a symbol of destruction. But it was the Huns, under Attila, who struck true fear into the Roman heart. Ferocious, fast, and seemingly unstoppable, they invaded deep into the empire. Though Attila never took Rome, his threat forced emperors to pay tribute and exposed the weakness at Rome's core. These invasions weren't just attacks. They were the final unraveling of an empire that had stretched itself too far, for too long. For centuries, Rome had stood untouchable, the heart of an empire that ruled the known world. Its legions had conquered kingdoms, its roads tied continents together, and its name inspired fear and reverence alike. But in 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Rome fell. The invaders weren't Persians or Carthaginians. They were the Visigoths, former allies of Rome, led by a man named Alaric. Once promised protection and partnership, the Visigoths had been mistreated, overtaxed, and ignored. Their loyalty snapped. They marched on the empire, not as bandits, but as a displaced people demanding justice. After years of tension, broken negotiations, and siege, Alaric's army breached the gates of Rome. For 3 days, the city was looted. Treasures were stripped, homes burned, and Roman citizens, once the rulers of the world, watched helplessly as their past crumbled. Though the destruction wasn't total, the symbolism was earth-shattering. Rome had not been sacked in 800 years. To many, it was the end of the world. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, mourned, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" The sack of 410 wasn't just a military event. It was a turning point in the Roman psyche. The Eternal City was no longer eternal. Its fall exposed how far the West had declined and how vulnerable it had become. Rome had conquered the world. But now, the world was closing in. In 476 CE, a boy sat on the throne of Rome. Not a Caesar, not a conqueror, but a teenage puppet named Romulus Augustulus. His name echoed greatness: Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, its first emperor. But history would remember him for something else: being the last. By then, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of itself. Its economy was broken, its army filled with mercenaries, and its authority limited mostly to Italy. Real power belonged not to emperors, but to warlords and foreign generals, men like Odoacer, a commander of Germanic troops serving Rome. Tired of taking orders from weak emperors and unpaid by a collapsing treasury, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, Rome's new capital. There, he forced the young Romulus to abdicate the throne. But instead of executing him, Odoacer spared the boy's life and sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, signaling the West no longer needed an emperor. It was a quiet end to what had once been the greatest empire on earth. No last stand, no glorious battle, just a throne vacated and a chapter closed. To many at the time, it didn't feel like the fall of an empire. But looking back, 476 CE marked the death of Roman rule in the West and the beginning of a new era, one that would be ruled by kingdoms, warlords, and the long shadow of what Rome once was. The empire hadn't exploded. It had faded. We're often told that 476 CE marked the fall of the Roman Empire. A teenage emperor, Romulus Augustus, was forced off the throne by a Germanic general, and just like that, Rome was gone. But the truth is more complicated. What fell in 476 was only the western half of the empire, a broken, battered shell of what it had once been. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, didn't just survive, it thrived. Known later as the Byzantine Empire, it carried on Roman traditions, law, and identity for another 1,000 years. Its emperors still called themselves Caesar. Its currency was stamped with Latin and Greek. Its government, military, and bureaucracy all traced their roots back to Rome. Even its greatest church, Hagia Sophia, was built under the Eastern Emperor Justinian, who saw himself not as a Byzantine, but as a Roman restoring lost glory. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome's influence didn't vanish. It transformed. Germanic kings wore Roman titles. The Latin language lived on. The Catholic Church, centered in Rome, preserved Roman law, philosophy, and authority. Even Charlemagne, crowned in 800 CE, claimed to revive the Roman Empire in the West. So while the Western Empire fell politically in 476, Rome didn't die. It morphed, echoed, and lived on, in law, in language, in religion, and in the very idea of civilization itself. Because Rome was never just a city or an empire. It was an idea. And ideas are much harder to kill. By the 6th century CE, the Western Roman Empire had been gone for decades. But in the East, the empire still stood, proud and defiant. And at its helm was a man who believed Rome could be whole again, Emperor Justinian I. Ruling from Constantinople between 527 and 565 CE, Justinian didn't just inherit the throne, he inherited a dream. A dream to rebuild the Roman Empire, to reclaim the lands lost to the so-called barbarians, and to restore imperial glory. And he meant it. With his brilliant general Belisarius, Justinian launched a series of military campaigns that shocked the world. In North Africa, they crushed the Vandals in just a few months. In Italy, they battled the Ostrogoths for nearly 2 decades, retaking Rome, Ravenna, and more, though at a terrible cost. Cities were reduced to rubble, and Italy was left bleeding. Justinian didn't stop with swords. He rewrote the law, creating the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code, a legal system so influential that it still echoes in modern courts. He rebuilt Hagia Sophia, one of the most magnificent churches in the world, a symbol of imperial strength and divine favor. But the dream came with a price. The wars drained the treasury. A devastating plague swept through the empire. And while Justinian had recovered the western lands on paper, they proved impossible to hold. Still, his efforts marked Rome's last great resurgence, a final flame before the empire settled into its Byzantine identity. Justinian didn't save the Roman world, but he reminded it what it once was. After Justinian's bold reconquests in the 6th century, the Roman Empire in the East, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, endured, but it never returned to its former glory. Over the next 9 centuries, it would fight to survive a world that kept changing around it. The empire shrank, bit by bit. Slavs, Bulgars, Arabs, and Turks chipped away at its borders. Internal strife, religious conflicts, and political infighting weakened the state from within. And then came the Crusades, originally meant to defend Christianity. But in 1204, Western European crusaders turned on Constantinople itself. They looted the city, shattered its defenses, and installed their own Latin rulers. By the time the Byzantines regained their capital in 1261, it was a shadow of its former self, beautiful but broken, proud but poor. The empire had become a city-state with history, clinging to old grandeur as the world moved on. Then came the Ottoman Turks, rising in strength, ambition, and numbers. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. The defenders, outnumbered and outgunned, held the walls for weeks. But the end was inevitable. On May 29th, the Ottomans broke through. After more than 1,000 years, the last Roman stronghold fell. But even as the crescent moon flew over Hagia Sophia, Rome's legacy did not die. It lived on, in law, language, architecture, religion, and in the very idea of civilization. Because though the empire fell, Rome never truly disappeared. It simply became part of all of us. The Roman Empire may have crumbled, but its influence never vanished. Instead, it wove itself into the fabric of the modern world, shaping how we think, build, worship, and govern. Roman law was one of the empire's greatest gifts. From the 12 Tables to Justinian's Code, Roman legal principles emphasized contracts, property rights, and citizenship. Centuries later, these ideas would resurface in European civil law, American legal systems, and international courts. The notion that all are equal before the law? That's Roman. Rome also built in stone and ambition. Its architects mastered the arch, dome, and concrete. Structures like the Colosseum, aqueducts, and roads weren't just engineering feats. They were symbols of permanence. Today, modern stadiums, government buildings, and highways still echo Roman design and durability. In language, Latin became the root of the Romance languages: Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Even English, though Germanic, is filled with Latin-based words in law, science, and politics. Latin was the language of scholars, priests, and empires long after Caesar's Rome had fallen. Religion, too, was transformed. Christianity, once persecuted, became the empire's official faith under Constantine. The Roman Catholic Church inherited not only spiritual authority, but also the empire's structure, rituals, and language. And in government? The Romans introduced the world to checks and balances, senates, republics, and the power of written constitutions. Rome may be gone, but we live in its shadow still. Rome didn't just leave behind ruins and relics. It left behind an idea, one so powerful, it would shape the dreams of nations centuries later. In the United States, the Founding Fathers looked to the Roman Republic as a model. They studied Cicero, feared tyrants like Caesar, and built a system of checks and balances that mirrored Rome's Senate and consuls. Even the Capitol building, crowned with a dome, evokes Roman grandeur. The very word Senate, Roman. The Roman eagle, adopted as a symbol of American strength. In Europe, monarchs and popes claimed Roman descent to legitimize their rule. Charlemagne called himself Emperor of the Romans. The Holy Roman Empire, neither holy, Roman, nor truly an empire, borrowed its name to tap into Rome's ancient prestige. To be Roman was to be civilized, powerful, eternal. And in the modern West, Rome became a mythic mirror, a symbol of order, ambition, decadence, and decline. Some saw it as a warning, others as inspiration. From marble courthouses to political rhetoric, Rome still haunts the Western imagination. It represents what we aspire to and what we fear becoming. Because deep down, the West doesn't just remember Rome. It still wants to be Rome.